an entomologist when I grow up.
Bienvenue and welcome to Cirque du Soleil, a sonic trip brought to you by Cirque du Soleil. My name is Michel. I'm the creative guide and the stage director of some of our shows, and I'll be your host for today. Right now in the background, you're hearing the spellbinding music of Ovo. Ovo is a very unique and colorful show that's set in an ecosystem where insects work, play, fight, and look for love in a non-stop riot of energy in motion. Today on the show, we want to explore how the study of insects opens up so many creative possibilities and ultimately benefits humanity. And we want to look at the relationship between fear and creativity. Hello, Dr. Sammy. Welcome to the Cirque du Soleil podcast.
Hey there. I'm so excited to be here. This is going to be awesome.
I have a question. Have you seen Ovo on video or live?
So I have some feelings about this. Ovo came out when I was in graduate school, and I was very, very busy with a project where I was actually working to try to get a parasite that I was studying, a parasite of honeybees. I was trying to get it to lay eggs. And it's so funny to me that I ended up missing Ovo because I was so focused on this parasite's eggs. So I succeeded. I got the parasite to lay eggs, and it was a really big deal because it's the first time it's happened in the lab. But it was no longer playing in my area when after I finished the project. So if it's still playing somewhere, let a brother know.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I want you to see it live. Video is good, but live is much better. So we'll arrange that. And it's funny because when you get to the show, you see a huge, gigantic egg. And there's no explanation. It's just like, so that's why like you really feel like a little bug because it's the size of the egg is gigantic. And but wait. You were trying to get the parasite to lay eggs. Okay, this is not my everyday life task. How do you do that?
So here's
you talk sweet words.
Not quite. I mean, you play a little Barry White, turn down the candles, and everything. That whole deal. Well, what you really have to do in a circumstance like that, you have to shrink yourself down, just like you were talking about for the performance of Ovo. Mm-hmm. You have to shrink yourself down to the size of an insect. You have to try to think about what an insect wants and needs to feel comfortable, because you're not going to leave your baby somewhere where you don't think that it's going to be safe and have everything that it needs. And so I had to figure out all the things that this parasite needs, all the nutrition, the right environment, the right temperature, the right humidity. And when you finally get everything just right, you're aware of it because something happens that hasn't happened before. You see an egg deposited.
Dr. Ramsey, you've done a lot of research revolving around insects. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this. I mean, aside from butterflies and maybe ladybugs, and I have to disclose also I have twin girls of 4 years old, and they're passionate about ladybugs and about all of the insects. I'll tell you later about it. But so a lot of insects have had a bad reputation, at least in our very immediate culture of North America. And because people think, they invade your home, your personal space, they sometimes eat your food or leave their germs all over it. And generally, insects are not very well liked by many people. So before we get into more of your work, I have my first question that I have to ask, what made you interested in studying bugs?
For sure. And I think it's important to say insects are not liked by many people here in the Western world, but I've done a lot of traveling and experienced other cultures and gotten to see that people get really excited about insects, throw entire festivals for them in other countries, especially in Southeast Asia. There's just a beauty to the ways that people open their windows and their doors and welcome that part of life into their lives. Insects are absolutely incredible organisms. I like to say that entomology is the study of diversity, because there is no more diverse group of organisms on this entire planet. 3 out of every 4 animals is an insect. There are more than 1 million described species of insects. And diversity is all about figuring out new, novel ways to live in a particular area, to solve the different problems that life throws at you. And one of the most amazing things is that there's so much that we can learn from insects. We learned how to make paper from watching paper wasps thin out reeds and strands of plants into this very flat surface. And we thought, oh, I could write on that. So we took the idea, gave them none of the credit. You know how we do. We've seen so many things that insects have done and been awed by them. And that's because these creatures have figured out more than 1 million ways to solve all of the same problems that life has thrown at us. And so it honestly is a real waste that we've spent so much time being afraid of them, because insects are the most fascinating thing you've ever stepped on. And for me, when I first figured that out, I was a little kid. I was 7 years old. I was absolutely terrified of insects. And
really? Okay.
Some of your listeners who have heard me on another podcast or seen my TED Talk or the special on Hulu, have heard me talk about this, but I was absolutely terrified. I was so afraid that I didn't want to go outside for recess because there were too many bugs out there. I was having nightmares about them on a regular basis. Yeah. And my dad would have to run in the room at night and step on invisible bugs to get me to fall asleep because I was that anxious. And what happened? My parents decided, you know what? This has become an irrational fear and it's not going away on its own. We have to do something about this. Or it's going to interrupt the rest of his life. And so they took me to a library. They got me a library card at age 7. And they told me people fear what they don't understand. And
so true. So many things.
Yes. And I believed them because I was this little kid and parents seem like they know everything. Little did I know that they had no idea what they were doing. They've told me since then that they were going to try a little bit of everything and hope something worked. And that happened to be the thing. Because after a summer of constantly going to the library and checking out book after book after book about insects, I learned that they had the same motivations that we have. They want the same things that we want. They build these fascinating, incredibly intricate, complex societies. They're out here. I remember the first book that made me really feel some feelings towards insects was called Chirping Insects. Just a really simple book about creatures like katydids and crickets that make a lot of noise that kept me up at night because I had really sensitive ears and I hated crickets and katydids. To find out that they weren't making this noise to get on my nerves, but were instead making this noise because they were lonely and they needed to find a mate. They were singing a beautiful love song of I want someone else in my life. That hit me so hard as a little kid. Now, I remember riding back from the library with my mom and telling her, hey, Mom, I want to be an entomologist when I grow up. Age 7, knew the word and everything because I'd done quite a bit of reading. Wow. And clearly, I was an accurate narrator of things because, 20-something years later, here I am, the endowed professor of entomology at the University of Colorado Boulder.
Wow, big bravo. But I like the fact that your parents were really instead of ignoring your fear, trying to just shove it up, okay, let's face it, let's give him the tools, hoping that they're the right tools. And then from this, you built your power. It's funny because I love insects too, not to your point, but, and I was very, very careful with my, I'm the only parent of twin girls of 4 years old, and so I feel really responsible for them. I wanted to raise them with as little fear as possible, because fear is just blocks you from other people and from yourself and stuff. So I always, and there are kids who would play in the playgrounds or in the older kids sections, because I taught them how to fall and, wash your hand, watch your hand, watch your foot and so on. But insects, I really found out that up to the moment they were at the daycare, they had no fear. And then suddenly, one of them feared the spider. And I said, what is going on here? And it was one of the educator who had screamed at seeing. So I made a lot of work to just reestablish. And I work with riggers
who make like all the rigging systems. Like rigging is if you suspend a trapeze, how do you do that? So this is one of my favorite group of staff at Cirque. So when I look at the spider web, I can appreciate how complex it is.
Yes.
So whenever there's a spider web, I tell my kids, I say, look at this. And my dad was an engineer. I said, this is so spectacular in the way they adapt to every space. So I find out like now they're really passionate to the point that they bring things in the house all the time.
That was me.
And I'm okay with this. And they will lift the things in the backyard and there's no insect that repels them. So, that's why on a personal basis, I'm really happy that we talked today because I think your job and our job here is a celebration of life. So I've always about bugs, and it's funny that we're talking about kids and you being a child fascinated by insects because one, in creation and the process of creation at Cirque is very intuitive. And our filter of decision is not, does it make sense? It's more like, does it create an emotion? So we created the OVO with this director, Debra Kolker from Brazil, and it was never intended to be for kids. But we found out the first 4 days of shows that the kids were reacting so well to that show. We had to adjust a bit the marketing. And like even the merchandising was not thought so much towards kids, and it was a big surprise. And we had worked 2 years of that show, and it brings up the topic of fear. And what happens when we confront fear? Fear is in everyday's life in an acrobat. And I was surprised when I started to work at Cirque that an aerialist, I thought, okay, she's really comfortable in the hoop up there. Yes and no, like she still fears. But she goes, she's dancing with her fear, but every day she's fearful. So that commands even more respect. And a lot of artists will say, do the thing that you're afraid of, because this will lead you along an authentic and rewarding artistic path. So we do this. We control the risk all the time, but we do not evacuate fear because there's a lot of teaching in that. I have a question. Okay. Can you talk about how gathering knowledge, and you already touched that a little bit, but I want you to hear more, how gathering knowledge helps you overcome your fear of bug and in other aspects of your life? Like, for example, when you started to teach, you had some, is it a pattern, like gathering knowledge makes you overcome your fear?
I think it is a pattern that gathering knowledge helps you overcome your fear, because when you're uninformed about a thing, you behave out of instinct. You go with your sort of lizard reptilian brain, and it's all about protection. And so there are these quick, jerky motions that don't always translate to something worthwhile. Oftentimes it's about getting distance from a thing or destroying a thing. But when you actually learn about something, when you no longer have to interact with it on the basis of your basal emotions and your instincts, then you can have a much more complicated relationship with that thing. You can have a more intricate understanding of it and apply that abroad. Like with teaching my students, I've had the opportunity to watch them navigate through their understanding and connection to insects. It tends to start with fear, but it always ends up with something much more complex and interesting than that at the end. And they may not be in love with insects by the end of it, but their feelings toward them are always much more complicated and informed than they were prior to that. And I think that that's incredibly worthwhile.
You didn't say like it goes from fear to like just complete acceptance. It goes from fear, which is very simple, to something more complicated. I love that.
What would be your advice for kids or adults how to get over their fear of bugs? So documentation is definitely one. Is there other ways, or watching a movie about it? Or
I've got a lot of advice there, because there was one way that worked for me. So I know a tried and true method of reading about them can be very, very, very useful. But I think it's also really helpful to interact with them, because after I read about them, then I went outside to test my knowledge. So it turns out that this grasshopper isn't trying to get on my nerves, or it turns out that bees aren't interested in my demise. They just want to go on about their business and not have me take their honey. Those sorts of things. Every time I met with an insect that I thought was in some way out for my ill, and it wasn't, it helped to diminish the sense of fear that I felt before. Oftentimes, I felt a bit silly about the way that I had built these creatures up, because you think to yourself, what a waste of time it would be to wake up in the morning as an insect and think, how many humans can I terrorize today? You got to have better things on your schedule than that, right? Well,
yeah, their survival is not based on inducing fear on the big creatures there.
Exactly. And then in addition to all of that, so in addition to learning about them from books, learning about them in person, it's also really helpful to actually interact with other people who have either been through this level of fear or who can just talk to you about their passion. One of the things that I think is very transformative in these contexts is listening to people talk about just how passionate they are about insects, how wonderful insects are. David Attenborough is really incredible at this sort of thing. I loved his documentary, Life in the Undergrowth, and just listening to the passion and awe in his voice as he watches spiders living their life on a silken thread, and how they're spinning this tiny little thread through the air that is stronger than steel of the same thickness, and how silk as thick as a pencil could stop a bus. Like that kind of stuff, when you listen to people in awe of it, it does something to you. It reminds you that that world is much more complex than simply the fear that you started with.
I want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about bees.
Absolutely, and thanks for giving me this platform to advocate for an incredible insect that's done a lot of good for us as human beings. So insects in general are very important for our way of life. They maintain pretty much every terrestrial ecosystem on this planet. They are essential to how our world functions. But there are certain creatures that rise above the normal standard of supporting ecosystems to being what we call ecosystem engineers. These organisms are keystone species. That means if you remove them from a context, the whole thing falls apart. There's some that are important, but even if removed from a context, things can carry on. There are keystone species that you just can't do certain things without. A big reason for why honeybees exist as a keystone species, as ecosystem engineers in some ways, is simply because they pollinate very, very well, and they pollinate a ton of different plants. Now, there are some insects like squash bees that can pollinate squash better than a honeybee can. And that's great. But the thing that makes honeybees so remarkable is that they are generalists. You can bring them into pretty much any ecosystem and they will find plants to pollinate, and they'll be very good at it. The other thing that's quite remarkable is that they practice something called flower fidelity. And flower fidelity means that they are faithful to certain flowers.
Really? Like they've got a type. They've got a type. Okay.
Exactly. They've got a type. They've got a type. It may sound like that runs at odds with what I just said earlier about them being generalists, but they only practice flower fidelity for a time. So a specific set of flowers that they've fallen in love with, they will be in love with that group of flowers until they return to the colony. And then they'll go out and find another group of flowers. Why is that important? Well, other bee species that are more generalist, they will fly to one flower, and they will carry pollen on their bodies, on all of their hairs, and they'll land on another flower, and all of that pollen is wasted because the pollen from one flower, that's the genetic material from that plant. It doesn't work on another species of flower. So if you are going to be the best partner to a flower, you are only going to go to flowers of that same species. And that's something that's allowed honeybees to become some of the most rewarding pollinators on this planet, because the flowers that they land on, when they go to another one, they're always bringing pollen from that species to that flower. It makes them incredible pollinators. And you'd have to think, why would they do this? It would be more efficient for them if they just collected pollen from any of the flowers that happen to be in that one area where they are. Why are they only going to the same flowers?
I think I have an answer, because their behaviors will allow the duplication of flowers, so there's more resources of pollen.
their survival is connected to the survival of the flowers.
Exactly. It's a
I love them even
mutualism.
more. Wow.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? It's a mutualism. My research is all about symbioses. And symbioses are really close relationships between organisms. They're not always good for both creatures. Parasitism is a symbiosis. People often forget that, and they think that symbiosis only means mutualism. But honeybees exemplify a mutualistic symbiosis where their benefit is tied to the benefit of the flowers. And so they, even though this could become and has become a conflict in some kinds of pollinators where they will actually try to steal nectar from flowers and things of that nature, the honeybees tend to play fair as much as possible, and they try to benefit the flowers, and the flowers benefit them.
My God, we want bees for politicians. It's true. Because they're
I fully agree with you.
Oh my God, my God.
What can I do in my everyday life? And what are the solutions that have been advanced? I hope there have been some. What's going on right now? Are we saving the bees?
Thank you for asking me that. As someone who is working specifically in a field where I want to see the bees thrive as much as possible, it's always nice to get an update on what's been changing. We know that the same way that we have been in a pandemic over the past couple of years, the honeybees have been in a pandemic for decades. There is a disease that's spread between colonies, and it is a parasitic disease from this parasite Varroa destructor. It's a parasite that we haven't understood for a long time because, unfortunately, there wasn't always substantial investment in understanding the diseases that these creatures are facing before the disease becomes a big issue. Oftentimes we wait for it to become a gigantic problem and for it to destroy all kinds of livelihoods before we invest in it. Well, we've really started investing time in understanding these parasitic diseases. And we know now, actually from the research that I conducted as a graduate student, that this parasite is causing so many problems because it's feeding on the bee's liver. It actually releases digestive enzymes into the bee's body. You probably didn't know bees had livers, right? They totally do, and they're really important. And so this actually liquefies, when they release the saliva into the bee's body, it liquefies the bee's liver, and then the mites suck that out of the bee's body. And you can probably guess, that's not great for you. You know, if a mosquito landed on you and liquefied a chunk of your liver and sucked it out of your body, you'd probably be, a little upset about that, right? And that's a lot worse than what we thought was happening, because prior to this, we thought that they were just draining out a small amount of the bee's blood, and blood is replaced every day inside of the bee's body. But they can't grow a new liver. They can't even grow a new section of liver that's been removed. And so they lose the functioning of that organ over time, and it makes them very, very ill. And unfortunately, the parasite is easily transmissible between colonies. And we found in recent studies of this parasite that it's present in at close to 99% of honeybee colonies throughout the U.S. It's finally become a cosmopolitan parasite. It's on every continent, in nearly every country where bees are kept. It just reached Australia, which was the final bastion, the only place where it wasn't present. And so
I'm surprised because the vector of transmission must be both and stuff. And when we traveled to Australia with our tours, you would see the protocols of disinfection and stuff, and I think out of Australia, it's mostly going to, but you flew to Australia, you see when they have but everything in our equipment and stuff is like thoroughly disinfected and stuff. So the parasite still made its way.
Unfortunately, it still did. And we live in a very interconnected world. An interconnected economy, an interconnected ecosystem. And so that means that it's very difficult to create the discrete ecosystems that once existed, where you could say, this is the Oceanian ecosystem, this is the Southeast Asian, the South Asian, the American. It just doesn't work that way anymore. Creatures move just as quickly as we move from place to place. Well,
and what's the solution? How can we get rid of the parasite without like putting chemicals and destroying the things? Is there like a biological solution to that?
Well, so we have kind of been on this treadmill. We've been running as fast as we can to keep the colonies alive and going as long as possible until a solution that is more sustainable is brought to bear. Well, currently, we are spending a lot of our time and a lot of our money applying pesticides inside of colonies and treating colonies. And it puts a lot more pesticide into the environment. But the alternative is to let our bees be like, mangy cattle roaming around in a field covered in parasites. It's just not ethical to let those bees live in that situation. Well, thankfully, there are at least a couple of labs right now working on developing more sustainable solutions to these problems that utilize an understanding of how this parasite feeds and its natural behaviors to attempt to develop a new system that could eventually eradicate this parasite rather than just control it slowly over time. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing those novel treatment options exist. But at the moment, it takes time for us to understand the impact that could have on the environment. And we want to make sure that we don't just throw something new in there that could have non-target effects.
Like tomorrow, I wake up, what can I do in terms of my impact to save the bees?
For sure.
Save the world. What can I do?
What can we all do in these contexts? Well, the most important actions that we can take, I'd narrow it down to 3 things.
Okay.
1, it's very, very, very important that we make sure that our pollinators have plenty of food and a really well-stocked pharmacy. Honeybees are incredible pharmacists. Oftentimes when they get sick, they can find things in the natural environment around them that can cure them. There are all kinds of plant resins with antibacterial and antifungal properties. And the bees are, I shouldn't say aware, because too much of anthropomorphization can confuse us as to how they work. But evolutionarily over time, they've found these things to be very effective. The problem is they can only utilize them if they are in their vicinity. But what have we as humans done? We have, unfortunately, gotten rid of the diversity of plants around us in favor of a bunch of grass. And we will use all the water in the world to keep that grass as green as possible when it has really no ecological benefit to the vast majority of organisms around it. But we can do so much better if we simply plant a garden. Even 1 square foot of flowers, of a diversity of flowers planted in an area can be huge for pollinators. So if you can find the time to plant native plants in your area, or even rewild your lawn, stop letting it be this jade wasteland of only grass and actually turn it into this multicolored, pristine field of flowers. It's actually fairly easy. Stop mowing your lawn, you save yourself some time, and the bees are a lot happier. Sometimes your HOA isn't as happy, but, sacrifices.
Wow.
I hope you're enjoying my conversation with founder and director of the Ramsey Research Foundation, entomologist Dr. Samuel Ramsey. We're talking about many things, and one of them being how leaning into our fears by learning about various kinds of insects can facilitate growth, creativity, and boundless solutions for humankind. Fans go first. Whether it's early access to seasonal deals or pre-sales, pick your tickets before everybody else. Sign up for Club Cirque today, and you'll be the first to hear about access to special events, pre-sales, and discounts. Take a look behind the curtain and enjoy up-to-date news on all things Cirque du Soleil, including shows, artists, and latest innovations. Visit cirquedusoleil.com to subscribe. So, Dr. Ramsey, I have a few other questions for you. You and I could speak for hours. The world of bugs is so fascinatingly complex because the more I listen to you, the more I realize you're talking about us. And the whole notion of interdependence and diversity. The survival of humanity is really, it's very almost mythological, the study of insects, because it's the same symbols and the same forces in action that what could lead us to happiness or what could lead us to destruction. I want to play you a little clip. Okay. You will hear the voice of the late Georges Brossard. He was the consulting entomologist that we work with for OVO creation.
The mission is simple. I want to reconcile humans with this animal class that has a lot of class, insects. Insects are producers, pollinators, scavengers, farmers, feeders. Their contribution is huge. the Earth and the planet wouldn't be what it is without the presence and the activities of my friend, the insect.
I fully agree. I mean, look, when you get a bunch of insect enthusiasts all together, we tend to have very specific thoughts. And we tend to agree very well with each other that insects are a group of organisms that have done so many things way before we ever figured it out. They were making paper. They were farming. They were creating these complex societies before we had ever even stepped foot on the planet, before the creatures that would eventually evolve into us ever climbed down from trees. And so seeing what these insects are capable of, unfortunately, that's a privilege that very few people actually indulge in because they spend so much time being afraid of them.
Back to the storytelling techniques. How do you use those storytelling techniques to showcase your findings in a way that appeals to a lot of people with sometimes less scientific knowledge?
I love seeing people who tell stories well, especially in non-traditional forms. And I loved seeing just a story being woven through the acts. The very first time I saw Cirque du Soleil, I think I was in high school. And I just thought it was the most incredible thing to see a story woven through what are typically a bunch of disparate acts. And I've learned over time that that same thing can apply in presentations that I give about insects, where people can think of it as just a bunch of disparate facts that I'm presenting to them or a bunch of disconnected slides. But when I weave a story throughout and I let them understand the beginning, the middle, and the end, my favorite part is watching people and looking at them track through this story with me and seeing that they often reach the conclusion before I even get there. That's how I know that they're a part of this story with me. And that helps me not have to tell them what they should understand or believe. Instead, they have figured it out, and that drives that point home so much deeper into their subconscious than anything else that I could have done. The power of storytelling is one of the most remarkable things on this planet. It's why cavemen painted on walls. It's one of the things that unites us as humans, is that we all have a narrative, and we can bring each other into the beauty of that narrative. And I'm hoping that more people will see that ability, and it will help to inspire compassion and understanding between us.
It feels more empowering if people are going to the conclusions themselves. And you said that fear creates distance. What you're doing creates proximity and empowerment. People will listen to you. I'd like to attend some of your workshops. Before I let you go, Dr. Ramsey, can you talk about a specific personal experience when your curiosity about insects led to a greater understanding, not of the insects, but of yourself and of the world we live in? And I know we can apply that to so many things, but I'm sure you have a story to tell here.
I certainly do. I love having a story to tell. And my story with that is simply, I was a little kid. And when I say little, I mean that literally. I was a very small child. So I was like, 45 pounds in the second grade, a tiny little skinny kid, shorter than everybody in his class, skinnier than everybody in his class. And seeing insects, these tiny diminutive organisms, they are able to accomplish incredible things. They can build structures visible from space. They can create ecosystems, and without them, we lose whole sections of our world. It was just so remarkable to me, and it inspired. It helped me see that there are ways that I had looked down on myself for not being as tall as everyone else, for not being as beefy as everyone else. I don't need to be in order to accomplish incredible things. And there are actually a number of things that I can do better because I am a more compactable human. And so it really lets you lean into your power and understand what it is that you are capable of to understand these lovable organisms.
It stands to me that, accepting the insect, the diversity of all that is accepting your own diversity in so many parts of yourself.
I want to thank you deeply, Dr. Samuel Ramsey, for joining us today.
Of course. Thank you.
To the listeners, I want to thank you for your presence. Join us for each episode as we delve into the themes and ideas that underpin Cirque du Soleil shows. Learn more about the roots of creativity and how to keep your eyes, mind, and heart open to new sources of creative inspiration. And remember, it can come from anywhere and anyone. Thank you so much for listening to Cirque du Sound. I am Michel. À la prochaine.
Cirque du Sound is produced by Cirque du Soleil with technical and story production by Jar Audio.
If you liked what you heard today on Cirque du Sound, please subscribe, comment, and leave a review.